Hi folks, my name is Adam and I like to make tiny nerdy things, and if you're watching this on March 10th, then today is March 10th, which means today is Mario Day. And in honor of Chris Pratt being Mario, I thought, why not make Mario being Chris Pratt? Full disclosure, my original plan was to make Chris Pratt but give him a sweet flavor saver, dope overalls, and an awesome red hat. But I am well aware of my sculpting skill level, and I know I don't have the chops to make an adequately accurate mustached Pratt in just a week and have it look anything remotely like what I want it to. In fact, it would probably be hard to make it look even remotely human. I am, however, quite confident in my ability to make Mario in the allotted time and have him looking at least borderline recognizable. I would assume this is because I've made him so many times, but if my copy has longs, lengths, and lunks or anything to go by, then it's gotta be something else. As a quick side though, I apologize if it looks like I'm using toenails for Mario's eyeballs, but I ran out of white clay and I had to use translucent clay, which is the usual color I use when making teeth or toenails. If it didn't look like that before I said it and I've made this video infinitely more unsettling by drawing attention to it, then I'm sorry again. I'm also sorry for this picture. Probably one of the biggest reasons Mario's so easily recognizable is because he's got that sweet flavor saver that's pretty much his most important character trait, alongside of course his accent, but that's a little bit harder to show in sculpture format. I want Mario to be pulling a cheeky face in appreciation of the situation he's found himself in, so I'll build up a bit of extra scowl skin around his right eye, then pinch his face a bit to give him a bit of a sly look. Of course, the absolutely massive caterpillar eyebrows come in handy here to expand on that look, and once they're in place, I can start to add the final surface texture to his stash and brows before sticking some little coins of clay onto the side of his head to make his great big hearing holes. Finally, I'll give the pink fleshy parts a quick brushing with isopropyl alcohol to remove any fingerprints or tool marks, and I'm ready to add his body. As I always do when doing Mario, I like to make his body in sections, starting with his upper torso. I'm not going to be adding much detail yet, since all I want to do are get his arms and belly in place so that I can attach some little aluminium legs. I've rolled out some teeny tiny balls of brown clay that I'll smoosh and flatten and poke and prod until I've got a pair of adorable little leather combat boots. Once they've been baked in the oven to cure them, I can drill a little leg hole on the top and then stick my Mario in place using a little CA glue before getting to work bulking up his blue jeans. This particular Mario isn't going to be sporting his usual red shirt and blue overalls, but instead he's going to be getting a movie-accurate rendition of Pratt's all-American dino wrangling outfit, complete with a pair of extremely wrinkly blue jeans. It feels kinda wrong making Mario without light blue overalls, but I feel like Mario Odyssey set the stage for a slew of non-standard Mario outfits, and while I can't remember if there was a Jurassic World specific outfit, there was definitely a dinosaur, so I feel safe going all in on this crossover. Now in place of Mario's bright red long sleeve shirt, I've made his upper body out of fleshy pink clay so that I can give him a dark teal button up with rolled up sleeves and an open collar for maximum Mario sex appeal. With my unsettlingly sexy Mario baked again to cure the unbuttoned button-up, I can start to build his brown vest on top. It's easiest to make this in a few pieces, then join them at the seams, since it's really only the front and edges that need to be raised. Finally, I can add the final details like wrinkles and various tactical vest pouches. While I'm thoroughly enjoying the bald Mario look, and I think he's rocking the hell out of it, he does need a bit of hair to be both Mario and movie accurate, so I'll start building up the bald with little lumps of brown. I'd actually considered giving him a little Crocodile Dundee type hat, but decided that sometimes Mario doesn't need a hat, so instead I'm just going to give him his patent pending tufts of hair in the back and move on to making his hands. As I mentioned before, I ran out of white clay, so I'll have to make them out of gray and paint it later, but that actually works out well since it acts as easy shading when it comes time to add a little extra detail. I could have made his hands out of fleshy pink clay since I've got lots of that, but I've already made him without his red shirt and overalls, and I'm just not emotionally stable enough to deviate any further from the original design. So instead, gray painted white will have to do. Speaking of which, the sculpting is finished, which means I'm ready to start adding the various top coats, which I'll mostly do by repainting all the clay with color-appropriate glazes. This will add a bit of depth to the colors, and by letting the paint settle into the folds and wrinkles, it'll also help to add a bit of easy shading. Anytime I use colored clay, I like to repaint it afterwards to bring out all the surface details, and I generally use Vallejo Express colors since they're super vibrant, easy to apply, and they aren't reactivated by subsequent layers later. They're also not a sponsor, so if you're watching Mr. Vallejo, please send me lots of money to keep saying nice things. Once I've got my various colors added on top, I'll come back and finish Mario off by giving his lifeless white eyeballs some big beautiful blue peepers that get covered in a layer of UV resin. Otherwise, 6.5 minutes in, that's the first of 4 sculptures done, so it's time to get to work on some dinosaurs. Now, I knew I wanted to replace the raptors with Yoshi, but I wasn't sure what exactly to do as far as the design was concerned, so I turned to my delightful patrons who overwhelmingly voted for a set of 3 Yoshis, but as halfway amalgamations between raptors and the classic design. But tastefully done, you know? Now, like Mario, Yoshi is pretty top-heavy on account of his oversized noggin, but unlike Mario, he's a little less stable on account of it not being located directly over his legs. To that end, I'm gonna need to make Yoshi a sturdy armature skeleton to stand on. As is often the case though, poor planning in this stage is gonna come back to take the legs out from underneath me later, but like I said, that's later, and later is a problem for future Adam. Instead, right now Adam can confidently and contentedly create an aluminium monster to build up the bulk of Yoshi before slapping on a layer of clay to begin making the body. I'm going to be making the body out of gray clay since I don't really know what colors I'm going to be going with as far as my trio of Yoshis is concerned, and gray is a pretty neutral color to paint over top of later. Mostly I've just got a whole lot of gray clay, so using that up for a project that's pretty much two-toned in the end makes a whole lot more sense. Otherwise, as far as my Yoshi is concerned, I'll mark out where his hips will be, then I can do some final smoothing before slapping on a pair of blue nitrile gloves. The gloves come with pre-textured finger textures that are perfect for texturizing my monster's skin. They're also really useful at keeping my hands from getting clay all over them, which isn't generally a problem, but when I'm feeling particularly lazy, I tend to use isopropyl alcohol to clean clay off my hands, and at this point, I think I may have done some permanent damage to my epidermis. So a pair of texture-imparting, skin-saving blue gloves should tick both those boxes nicely. Now, as for Yoshi, I've added lots of little wrinkles and skin folds around his limbs and along his tail where it curves, and I'll start to create a separation between his underside and his overside, I guess? Topside? Whatever the underside isn't. Now, while the gloves impart some excellent minor surface texture, to add some larger scales and bumps, I'll use one of my many tryptophobia-inducing dot rollers to randomly add little lumps and bumps around the surface. I'll then wrap the body in some cling film and add lots of slices and cuts to add that ever-important dinosaur battle damage. Then it's into the oven to bake the body so I can get started on the head. Now, as is very much a theme on this channel, I didn't have much of a plan going into this, so to mount my head I need to add some extra wire, which I'll make by attaching an initial length of wire in addition to the existing wire. Then I can bend some shortened lengths around my ball stylus, so I have 2 sets of little armature wire hoops. And using lots of glue and finer wire, I can then stick these onto the exposed spinal armature, which will give me a nice sturdy surface to begin building the upper and lower jaws on top of. Yoshi's got a pretty substantial head with an oversized round nose, so having a bit of extra support by way of a sturdy armature wire is going to make my life a hell of a lot easier moving forward. I think in the future it'd be helpful if I left myself some extra wire on the tips of all my armatures to allow for over or underestimating sizes, but then I've been saying that since I started and I haven't changed yet. Otherwise, once I've got Yoshi's upper and lower jaws in place and somewhat shaped out, I can start to bulk up his head by adding little strategic lumps of clay until I'm left with a shape that I'm happy with. Then I can start to smooth it all out and put my gloves back on to apply some more texture while I add the wrinkles to his neck. To make his eyes, I'll poke some big old holes in the side of his head so that I can drop some little eyeballs in place, then I can start to form the angry upper and bottom lids before covering them in a great big ocular ridge. I'll then stab the flat of my sculpting tool in the sides of his nose to make some breathing holes before adding some final scaly texture by way of roller. In order to make him a little less gummy, I need to add some gums so that I can stick some teeth in place. I've pre-baked these off camera so they'll keep their form as I jam them into his gums, and a little bacon bond will help them hold their position. I'll then add a little lip texture before getting to work on his tongue. Now I wanted to give Yoshi his patented chameleon tongue, so I'm going to wrap a thin layer of wire in some clay, then pinch and squeeze it and texturize it till it looks kinda like a tongue. Then I can roll it into an appropriate Yoshi tongue pose and jam it into the back of his throat before baking him once again and making some arms. I'll drill a couple holes around about where I think his arms would be, then stick some lengths of wire into place and wrap the tips with a little blob of clay. I can then start to build out the rest of his hands first by sticking a set of short sausages onto the blob and stabbing the tips with a tiny ball stylus for future finger stabbers before bending the arms into their final position so I can add the rest of the clay on top. I'll build up the bulk of the arms, then add some more wrinkles and skin folds around all the movie bits, then I can stab some claws into the tips of his fingies before adding texture via glove, roller, and silicone shaper. I was a bit premature with my original body baking since I forgot that I'd need to embed some spinal spikes along Yoshi's back, but that's easily remedied by adding a long wormy dealy along the length of his body and blending it in nicely. This will then give me a nice soft surface into which I can stab some grooves that I can then fill with those aforementioned spinal spikes. I've left a gap in the middle for the all-important Yoshi shell, which starts out as a big blob of clay that gets dropped into place, then I can start to mark out the edge of the shell. It's a bit too thick though, so I'm going to remove some of the excess clay, then round it out again and get to work adding the turtle shell pattern on top. Otherwise, once the pattern is complete, I can bake Yoshi again before finally getting to work on his feet. Now, remember when I said my poor planning would take my legs out from underneath me? Well, that was my attempt at being clever, since what I did was make the armature too short for Yoshi's feet, and to fix it, I'll actually have to remove his legs. Fortunately, it's a relatively simple surgery, starting by marking out where I want to remove the leg, then once I've cut away the clay just below the knee, I'll unwrap the wire, drill some holes up into the meat of the leg, then I can stick some new wire in place, bend it to match the existing armature, and rewrap it all together. Then it's pretty much the same process as making the arms and hands by building up the clay, refining the shape, poking the necessary talon holes, then filling those holes with talons, before finally adding the various levels of textures on top. Otherwise, that marks the last bit of sculpting to be done on Yoshi, and it's into the oven for a final bake. Which leaves me with one mighty fine looking, not quite a raptor, not quite a Yoshi amalgamation that I think is pretty tasteful, you know? Then it's just a case of repeating that entire process twice more to give me my final trio ready for painting. I'll start the painting process by giving Yoshi's belly and strong, scaly jawline a base coating of bone white by way of airbrush, since the idea of applying a dozen coats with a paintbrush makes my balls itch. I can then tackle the first of the Yoshis with a nice Yoshi green hitting pretty much the entirety of the rest of the body, only trying not to get overspray on the already painted bone white bits. I'll then repaint the high spots with a yellow to add some vibrant and brighter green highlights over his body before repeating the same process with the next Yoshi, but this time with a dark blue followed by a not as dark blue. Finally, the final Yoshi is going to be pink, so, pink followed by brighter pink highlights. Now the insides of the mouth get a series of darker pinks, purples, and lighter pinks to add some variation before the tongues all get a deep red top coat, since Yoshi's all about that red tongue. While I've got the red on my brush, I'll give the shells a couple coats of red as well, and then tickle the spinal spikes with some red of their own before coming back with some lighter reds and pinks to add a bit of gradient so it's not quite so flat. Once all the more aggressive colors have been added, I can start to repaint all the lighter colored sections, starting with bone white on the tips of the shells as well as all the toenails and fingernails, which will then get recoated with a darker sepia wash. Finally, some final finishing touches get added with white, and I'll repaint all the teeth white, followed by a light dry brush of brown to give them some dirty detail, and I can paint the eyes white, then work my way through some orange and yellow, followed by some black slits to give them a spooky dino look. Last but not least, the requisite UV resin eyeball coating to give them some depth, and I'll give all the tongues and mouths a coat of high gloss varnish to really goop them up. Otherwise, that's my dino trio finally finished, which means it's time to get on to making my base. Now, as far as the base is concerned, it took me a lot longer to make all these sculptures since, in a shocking twist, making 3 Yoshis took roughly 3 times as long as making 1 did. Fortunately, my goal was to recreate the Jurassic World meme with the 3 raptors, and upon closer inspection, they're all just standing on a big pile of wood chips. So I guess I'm making a big pile of wood chips. Of course, I don't have any wood chips, but what I do have are bamboo skewers and a coffee grinder. Now, the beauty of bamboo skewers is that they're made of bamboo, and bamboo is a very fibrous wood, which means that if you were to, say, chop it up and blend it in a coffee grinder, you'll end up with some pretty convincing looking miniature wood chips. To attach my chips to my base and to add a bit of color underneath, I'll mix up a little bit of Mod Podge and brown and ochre paint, then slather it over the entire surface. Before it dries, I'll add a bit of sand for some reason, I guess, then layer on a thick pile of bamboo wood chips. To keep the chips in place, I'll give the entire surface a heavy dousing with isopropyl alcohol before giving it an even heavier coat of thinned out watery PVA glue. Once the glue dried, I made the mistake of thinking it would look better with a bit of darker shading, so I sprayed the entire base with a sepia ink, then immediately felt regret since I liked it better when it was a lighter color. However, there's no going back and I've run out of bamboo skewers, so I'm going to pretend like I meant to do it and I know what I'm doing. All that's left then is to stick my trio of raptor Yoshis and my Mario Pratt in place, and that's us done, and on to the glamour shots. While Mario Pratt and Yoshi Raptors spin in the background, let me take a minute to thank the absolute gems over on Patreon who continue to support this channel, and a special shout out to my newest patrons, Luke Steakin, Steph Tracy, Jerry Kavanaugh, Ludo Creations, No One Special, Kasha Henry and Rufus, Alexandra Pierce, Rachel Anne-Marie Colapi, Edgar Gonzalez, Michelle McNichol, Apataco, Jake Woodcroft, Kim Harris, Kiki 00X, Taito Noctis, John Walker, Ski Avro, and Freya unless I did something daft. You are the rebuilt aluminium armature legs upon which this triple-bodied channel stands. I hope you liked this video because I'm pretty darn pleased with how it turned out, and I think it'll sit lovingly on my shelf for a day or two until I accidentally knock it over and break it. If you like this video, then thanks. Otherwise, we'll see you next time. Cheers.